They eventually introduced camels in the 1840s. So there were some explorers that came through and did different expeditions throughout Australia. Some of them would have done multiple expeditions, and depending on whether they had success early on, some explorers didn't have success using horses, so they moved to camels instead. And one of those was Ernest Giles, who named Catajuda Mount Olga. So because it was so hard to make it through Central Australia, it was decided that they needed to figure out how to get around and kind of pave a way from South Australia to North Australia and to West Australia through the centre here. So the government sent out John McDowell Stuart. John McDowell Stuart was an incredibly intelligent explorer. He's very, very good at finding water. He made his way through Central Australia in the 1860s, and his track that he created ended up becoming the Overland Telegraph Line and eventually the Stuart Highway.
Well, there you go.
A very fun fact for you. The Overland Telegraph Line very bumpy here. The Overland Telegraph Line is actually what gave cattle stations here in Australia the name station. I know in Canada at least we call them ranches. So the reason they're called stations here in Australia is because way back when they had the Overland Telegraph Line, they needed people to man the station. They needed people to continue on the communication to make it as efficient as possible to pass on that info. And in order to have people manning these stations, you would have needed them to live at these stations. And a lot of those people were farmers that had cattle. So that's where we get the term cattle station here in Australia.
There you go.
After John McDowell Stuart did his expeditions, we had Ernest Giles and William Christie Goss come through as well. They were the first Europeans to spot Ularu and Catajuda, and were also the two explorers to give them their European names, Ayers Rock and Mount Olga. These two explorers didn't realize that they were competing at the time. They had no idea that they were out doing the exploration at the same time. So Ernest Giles, he was the first European to spot Catajuda. He was up near Wanaka, which is Kings Canyon. So he spotted Catajuda from there, tried making his way down here, and was met with a giant salt lake called Lake Amadeus. He tried to cross it and failed. He had a very hard time with that. They all just sunk through. So they had to retreat and return back. By the time he got back, he saw footprints in front of where he left off, meaning somebody beat him to it. So he did not reach Ularu and Catajuda until after William Christie Goss did. So he's very, very devastated by that. However, since he was the first to spot Lake Amadeus and Catajuda, he earned the naming rights. So Lake Amadeus was named after the King of Spain at the time, and Catajuda was named Mount Olga by Ernest Giles after Queen Olga of Württemberg. Queen Olga was a Prussian woman. Ernest Giles decided to name these features features after these people because they were patrons of science. Now, William Christie Goss was the first European to step foot on Ularu and Catajuda. He had the naming rights to Ularu. So he named Ularu after Sir Henry Ayres, who was the Chief Secretary of South Australia at the time. So that is where we got the Europeans from.
Wow.
Over 100 years after that, it did. They've fallen under a dual naming system. Initially, it was like Ayers Rock, Ularu, Mount Olga / Catajuda, and then they flipped that in about 2002, I believe. So they're first known by their Anagu names, so their original names, and second by their European names. That's, you can call them whatever you'd like. I will call them by their original names, personally. But nobody really cares what you call them. A lot of people online like to fight about the names of these rocks for some reason. Anagu don't care. Anagu do not care. Nobody does, really. So it's not that big of a deal. But yeah, it's kind of funny to see in comment sections, anything I see about Ularu, a lot of people fight about the names of these formations, which I find quite comical. So through the early 1900s, Europeans did come back and forth a little bit through Central Australia here, sort of exploring to see about mining and pastoral potential. Very early on, they discovered that it would be terrible to farm out here. Just not ideal farming situation out here. Obviously, it's very, very dry. And mining also didn't last either, thankfully. But by 1920s, this area was, Ularu, Catajuda, and the Peterman Ranges were labeled as Aboriginal Reserve. But that unfortunately stopped in the 1930s, 1940s, when basically Europeans were like, wait, we actually like this place, we're going to take this back, because we can. So this was still basically in the 1920s, still there wasn't really regular European contact with Anagu yet. So very much, like I said, this harsh landscape has protected them, thankfully, for so long. Regular contact started in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So the people of South Australia, obviously, it's very hard times at that time. So people were having a hard time making ends meet. The South Australian government at the time tried to provide an opportunity to make some money for their people. So they offered money for dingo pelts. They were trying to control the dingo population in South Australia. So they would exchange money for dingo pelts to whoever brought them by. So we called these hunters, whoever went for those dingo pelts, they were called the doggers. So these guys went out hunting for dingoes and went up pretty far, ended up meeting with Anagu and saying, wow, these guys are way better at hunting than we are. Maybe we can just do the British thing and trade stuff with them, and they can just do all the work for us. So that's pretty much what they did. And this was the first introduction to European food for Anagu. Now, this trade relationship did not remain peaceful because, as I've said, this harsh landscape has protected them for a long time. It's also a big reason why there's more of a concentration or more of a diversity around the coast of mobs or Aboriginal people in Australia. lot less diversity in the center because of the harsh climate. Any peoples that lived here in the central or western deserts would have had to be nomadic and move around wherever they could find water or food. So because of that, Anago didn't have a lot of competition. So having the doggers come through, introduce some competition, that obviously really not ideal. So created a bit of tension and introduced that conflict. In the 1940s, the land was taken out of Aboriginal reserve land and sort of labeled as a wildlife reserve sort of thing. So initially the early stages of becoming a national park. And at that point they also were starting to slowly introduce tourism. Drive-in tours didn't regularly start until about 1958 with Len Tuitt. Len Tuitt was a tourism pioneer at the time. He outfitted old army trucks that he found in Alice Springs. And so he was doing driving tours from Alice Springs in those trucks. And because of him, they installed a fuel station at the Curtin Springs station so that he didn't have to have diesel drums in between all the guests throughout the whole drive down here. And around this time as well, this was when they would have started building the accommodation near Ularu and the airstrip as well. And eventually, not long after this, they would have also built or started the fly-in tours. Now, at that stage in time, Anaga were being pushed out from their land. Something that's a bit of a myth. A lot of people, when I started here, were saying that Anaga were classified as flora and fauna at this point under the government, which is not true. They were just not classified at all.
Wow.
So in the government's eyes, Aboriginal people did not exist. I would say both are equally as bad, but yeah, pretty insane. So in 1967 we had the referendum. This was a year after the Wave Hill Walk-Off started with the Gurindji people. So in 1967 we had the referendum where Aboriginal people were finally included in the census across Australia. So really, in other words, Aboriginal people in Australia were finally classified as people. 1967. Wave Hill Walk-Off started in 1966 and went on for about 7 years. This was on the Wave Hill cattle station, which was on Gurindji land. In order to stay on this land, Gurindji people had to work for this cattle station. They didn't like the treatment they were getting, so they protested. Demanded better treatment and eventually demanded their land back. And they were successful in the end. They got their land back. This is very inspirational for Aboriginal people across Australia, but especially Anaga. Alright, we're just pulling up to the park gate here, so those of you that need to buy the park pass, did anybody need to buy the park pass? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna pull over here, and whoever needs to buy the park pass, you'll just have to get out and purchase it from the park staff here.